Hi everyone. We've covered standards as well as the roles and responsibilities of a teacher, so we know that one of those is lesson planning. So this video will cover what goes into a lesson plan and how to utilize those standards in your lesson plan. To start your lesson plan, we have what I call part one, the context. Because we have ELLs and each of them has individualized needs or proficiency levels, it's helpful to specify that in the context portion of a lesson plan. It helps create a framework for the decisions you make in that lesson. The context would include the date that you're teaching, the topic of the lesson or the unit it's part of, something called class context, which is, are you teaching in a pull-out classroom or are you teaching mainstream? How many learners do you have? What proficiency levels are they? After that, you'll have the objectives and assessment. With objectives, we're going to take those state standards and write them into achievable goal statements for both content, so the state standard, and language, the WIDA standard. For assessments, it's important that we measure if students have met our objectives. So we'll need to specify what kind of assessment we're using and what material that requires. You could also specify what determines successful completion of that objective. Again, establishing this context helps establish your decision making. After you have a context, it's time to design the lesson plan. For a basic lesson plan, I like to make a table, but you could do it written out. But there's some key aspects I would want you to include in a lesson plan. The first we have is time. We want to guesstimate how much time we spend on a certain task in our lesson plan. Why do we need to judge time? It's a good practice as a teacher to know if we're taking too much time or too little time. Future you, when you look at the lesson plan, can realize, I need to cut back on this, or this is going to take longer than I think it is. Here's how I can modify or accommodate. Next, it's called goal, but this is the activity or what you're doing in the lesson plan, what you're trying to achieve. So it could be like a warm-up, activity, test, video, lecture, just specifying what's happening in the lesson plan. This helps us ensure that we have diversity, that we aren't just doing full lecture all day, that we have moments of scaffolding, of peer interaction, of support. Next, we have materials. We want to make a list of what the learners are going to use to complete that activity or moment in the lesson plan. It also could be what you need. This is a helpful checklist to make sure you are fully prepared, that you've printed your worksheets or whatever you need. Next, we have something called procedure or the details. You'd want to outline step by step what the teacher should do to instruct the students. You want to write something detailed enough that a substitute teacher can follow through on the plan. So this would, you would explain the verbal instructions you give, when you hand out things, how long it should be taking, that kind of material. The last part of the lesson plan is called contingency in this example, but it refers to things like differentiation plans, or if technology doesn't work, kind of making notes of how this can be adjusted or be flexible. So that's a basic lesson plan. To kind of break this down even more, I mentioned that in the context, you would need objectives. What does an objective look like? It usually starts with the phrase, students will be able to, suggesting that this is what it looks like when a student meets that objective. Objectives would be based on content and language again, so state standard versus WIDA standards. Objectives and standards are very similar in that they identify a goal, but objectives are more oriented toward the skill or expression that signals the standard has been achieved. So in that way, when you write an objective, you should focus on the verb, the outcome, and how the outcome was measured. So with verbs, a good way to do that is Bloom's taxonomy. And then for outcomes, and the form of that outcome, you would describe an assessment and this kind of expectation you have for that assessment. Here's some examples from, I think, Color in Colorado. And they can see the progression from a standard to a content and language objective. And we also see that the language objective, what's been bolded, is it focuses on the language domain and skill. So it isn't just that students know or understand, it's that students orally describe, that they summarize in writing. By specifying this domain, it helps in our assessment of that domain. So if you know they're orally describing, I'm going to have some sort of oral assessment. If they're summarizing writing, I'm going to have a writing assessment. So in this way, an objective gives us a clear path for what we're measuring and what students should be learning. With assessments, there are many types of assessments, and they're necessary. I think assessments get a bad rap, but assessments help us be held accountable and help us reflect. So with that, when I say assessments, it's not always a test. Activities, any product they make, moments they have can be used as assessment. It could be informal, formal, or formative versus summative. With that, I would encourage you to set aside intentional moments of informal, formative assessment to make sure students are progressing and on track. So with this, why do you have to put so much into your lesson plan? That's because lesson plans are very intentional and teaching is very intentional. If we don't plan proper objectives or assessments, if we aren't attending to things we know are pedagogically sound like scaffolding or proper methodology, then we risk not truly teaching. We risk just filling time with activities that we think are popular or fun, but we aren't teaching. We aren't making sure that students are learning. So yes, there are teachers out there that don't write very lengthy lesson plans, but it's likely because they've internalized a lot of their previous lesson plans and know or can justify why they're choosing certain methodology over others. So as a new teacher or teacher candidate, it's important that we practice writing lesson plans to internalize that theory and good practice. Another reason to have kind of more developed lesson plans is for situations where you have an IEP or have to submit materials for approval. By demonstrating that you are research-backed and doing something appropriate, you have a stronger lesson plan and evidence of your teaching. To continue then, I wanted to include an example of a lesson plan that I wrote real quickly. So this is an example of the context part. So you can see that I have date, topic, class, I have my standards and objectives, and my worksheet. And then here are the details of that lesson plan with time, task, procedure, material, and contingency plan. So I hope this video helps give you an idea of what goes into a lesson plan and that it helps give you structure as you practice writing them.